No game controller is perfect. As a matter of fact, with so many different kinds of options for game controllers, there are different kinds of controllers to suit different types of players. Even though there aren't that many categories per se, there's still different kinds of sizes and fits, button configurations that do suit different kinds of people. I've certainly been very guilty of being very picky and critical about what controllers are good or not. I've definitely been criticized for it in the past pretty heavily, and that's okay. My opinion is still my opinion, and what I'm going to share with you is also greatly my opinion, as I'm sure most people will still disagree with me. In the pursuit of the best controller for myself, I did come across one that does get very close to perfect here. It is all because of its amazing comfort, its size, its button configuration, how the buttons feel, and just so many things about this particular product that I love very, very much. However, this product cost me around $279, and I think that it is still priced at around there at the moment, and that is ridiculous for a game controller. It should be said outright. If I understand that that is a ridiculous price for a game controller and gaming isn't a necessity for myself, why do I still have this? Why did I invest in it in the first place? And it is because this is the one that suits my needs my best. With that said, let's look over the Razer Raiju Ultimate and decide if I was a complete fool, and let's decide if this is something that I should have completely stayed away from. I can say for sure that this is a game controller that you should probably stay away from, so stay tuned. The exterior design of this controller consists of this very soft touch material that kind of feels like leather, kind of feels like rubber. It is very difficult to explain exactly what it is. This is immune to fingerprints and all other kinds of finger oils, it seems, as I've never been able to get this guy dirty by just sweating on it or by getting any sort of finger grease on it. Not to mention that this texture in particular feels fantastic. This controller is larger than the majority of other controllers that you will see. It's definitely the biggest game controller that I have seen, for the exception of fight sticks, but that is a completely other category. This controller is massive. It is bigger than an Xbox controller and much bigger than a normal DualShock 4 controller. This is a PS4 controller, mind you, but it also works on PC. It is meant for both of those, which is why I got them, since I own both a PS4 and a PC. On the back of this controller, you're also going to find these amazing grips, and these are just perfect. They're incredibly comfortable, and I have to say that the shape, texture of this controller, and even just the overall heft, this is a pretty heavy controller, the heaviest probably that I have ever used, and all of these things just add to its cost and to how premium it feels. This is the best feeling controller that I have ever laid my hands on. Now, on the front of this controller, you're going to find the directional pad for up, left, right, and down. You're going to find both of your thumbsticks. You're going to find the menu button, or PS4 button, I should say, to turn on the PlayStation automatically, or to enter the menu settings. You're also going to find the share button, the trackpad with an LED strip right around it. You're going to find the options button, square, triangle, X, and circle. And you're going to find some of the newer implementations for the buttons over here, where you can lock in the configuration. You can cycle between profiles, the settings button, which is also for pairing this with your smartphone. Then on the top, you are going to find your L1, R1, L2, and R2 buttons, as well as your M1 and M2 buttons. These two are customizable. You're also going to find the proprietary entry, even though it is a micro USB port. This is meant for connecting this to any device that you want to use this with while charging as well. On the back, you're going to find these little trigger stops, which are going to enable how far your triggers can go. And it's just two configurations. There's just one to stop it halfway and another one to let you go all the way down. I prefer to stop mine halfway just because it feels clickier and I like the clicky feeling. You're also going to find on the back a switch to switch between PS4 Bluetooth, so to use this wirelessly with your PlayStation, the USB option, which is to just use this controller wired so that it only responds when it is connected to power, and the PC Bluetooth, which is obviously just to connect it wirelessly to your computer. And on the back, you're also going to find your M3 and M4 buttons, which are customizable, and you can customize these in software. At the very bottom, this is the very last thing, there's going to be a headphone jack. So that's about it. This is easily the most comfortable controller I have ever used. The texture on the front, the texture on the back, the shape, the grip, everything just seems perfect to me. Also, because of the weight, I feel like this controller is just so manageable. It just feels very good. I actually personally prefer heavy controllers, despite what kind of game I'm playing. Well, for the exception of turn-based games, but I digress. And the buttons placement is also great. Even though I have small hands, this is still a very manageable controller, in the sense that all the buttons are so very well within reach. Both thumbsticks are very easy to reach, as well as the programmable buttons. In fact, the programmable buttons this time around are so accessible that sometimes it's a little bit easy to hit them by accident. Especially for somebody like me. Usually have a very tight and firm grip on my controllers. And unfortunately, sometimes I end up pressing these buttons by accident. So sometimes it might just be best to disable these just for the sake of not running into any kind of unintentional button presses. This is still a very comfortable controller to hold, to use. I love it. Easily the best one in its class in that regard. Now, in terms of connectivity, there are many ways you can connect this controller to any devices. So in terms of connectivity, there are many ways to connect this controller to some of your devices. You can use this controller on your PC, and you can also use this with your PS4. There are 3 configurations in that sense. There's Bluetooth with the PS4, you can connect this with your PS4, and you can even use this to turn on the PS4 directly while using this as a wireless controller, which is a huge improvement from last year's or last generation's Razer Raiju. And there's the ability to use it wired. You do have to switch it over to the settings so that it would just connect through the wire itself. This is mostly how I like to play, actually, just because if I'm going to play on my PC, it's a little bit finicky to connect this through Bluetooth every single time, but that takes us to the other configuration, which is just PC Bluetooth, so that's how that can connect as well. The original model was just wired, and also you couldn't use it to turn on your PS4 on its own. You had to turn on the PS4 first and then use that controller, and it just wasn't very intuitive. But that changes completely with the Razer Raiju Ultimate. Now, customization with this controller is a mixed bag for me, and the reason for that is just because it is kind of unreliable. There are some customizations that are really cool. However, this is what I mean. In order to customize this controller, with most Razer products, you would just have to use the Razer Synapse. It's just one hub for all of your Razer stuff, and you can just customize everything there. However, I think that in Razer's attempt to somewhat simplify things, they did make things a little more complicated. Now, because the way that you would customize the Razer Raiju Ultimate is through the Razer Raiju app. And while it's cool to always have access to that, in theory it's great, but in practice it's actually pretty bad. And what I mean by that is just that the app is very unreliable. Every time that I want to connect the controller to the app, I have to do it in certain modes. I have to do it in either PC Bluetooth or PS4 Bluetooth. And I try to utilize the app and I try to connect them. The Razer Raiju app every single time forgets completely about what I did previously with the Razer Raiju, and every time I set it up, it does the same thing, and it just pretends like it can't connect to it for some reason. So it makes me re-register the Razer Raiju every single time that I want to make any kinds of customizations to this controller. For something so expensive, there shouldn't be so many reliability issues with this app. I have to say that I do hate having to go through this, which is why I barely go through any kind of customizations. However, when you do get the opportunity to get into the app, and once you're finally in, you better go through these customizations quickly, because if this controller goes to sleep, you have to re-register the controller just to use the app again. So here we go. Once you're in the app, you can adjust the strength of the motors for both sides of the vibration motors, that is, adjust them individually if you would like. I would prefer to just keep them at 100% at all times for both, just because I really like that strong vibrations or rumble feeling from the controller. You can also customize the patterns of the RGB light strip, customize the colors itself if you just want a static color, breathing effects, and that sort of thing. I like to keep the wave effect just because it is just one of the nicer effects in my opinion, so I just keep it that way. You can also customize what the M1, M2, M3, and M4 buttons do through here, so you can program these to any of the face buttons, or you can program them to any of the trigger buttons, which can be useful. You can also set different profiles for this controller, different configurations, and that sort of thing. I just like to keep one general profile. I don't do too much customizing to this controller for the reason that I just mentioned. I prefer to just get used to one due to the horrible reliability of the Razer Raiju app. But in terms of hardware customization, there's also a ton that you can do. You can actually swap out the sticks for both of these, and in the case, when you purchase the Razer Raiju Ultimate, it does come with a carrying case, and inside you're going to find a full D-pad replacement that you can use to swap out this little directional pad, so you can use that if you prefer. It is a little softer than this one. I do prefer the clickiness. You can also swap out the sticks. Actually, for different stick heads, there's a longer one included and a rounded one as well. So with those customizations in mind, there's definitely a ton to do. But lastly, you can adjust the trigger stops on the back. For most games, I prefer to keep these at the half stop just because I prefer the clickiness of it, but I know that a lot of people prefer the Xbox configuration where you can just press all the way down and it's a very smooth press. Now, I usually like to categorize or rate the performance of any controller based on how it performs on the kinds of genres of games that I like to play. So the first kind of game that I would like to present is Final Fantasy 15 4-hour action RPG. So this controller performs beautifully in this regard. This is my favorite controller to use for that genre, and it's just because of the clickiness of the buttons. You can reach other buttons a little bit more easily. Because some buttons when you use a controller are actually combined, such as the attack and run buttons, and I don't necessarily like that. So for attacking, I just prefer to use the circle button, and then for running, I can just program the M4 button for that, and that's just very nice because I don't have to do too much swapping around. It's just very convenient for me. I do prefer that. Also, just the overall comfort and the weight of this controller, it's just perfect. The joysticks also feel ideal for this sort of thing. I would not want to play Final Fantasy 15 with any other controller. So ideally for FPS games, you don't want to have to play with a controller if you can avoid it. You would want to stick with a mouse and keyboard just because it is more accurate, it's more effective for that kind of genres of games. If you prefer to play with a controller, either way, this is definitely a very strong contender for being one of the best ones you can use with it. You can actually swap out one of the sticks for the taller one, and I prefer to swap out the left one for it because that is the one that you would use to move around, to walk around, and it's just so much more comfortable. It makes reaching for things a little bit more easy, and that definitely helps out a lot. And actually, I know that most people do prefer to use the full trigger stop when you press all the way down for this kind of games, and I did find it to be a little bit more effective here just because it was just a little bit more comfortable to get the right press that you would want for being able to shoot your gun or something like that. And just the overall smoothness of the sticks, and even just the weight is very nice, though I think that for this kind of genre, most people would prefer a lighter controller. This is ideal for me. If I had to use a controller for first-person shooters, this is a controller I would use as well. So in a turn-based game like Final Fantasy IV, where you don't have to be so tense and you don't have to make very sudden movements or anything of the sort, it is just a turn-based game, so you just go through menus and that sort of thing. Even though it is active time, time is still running, but you're still not in so much as a rush as you would be in an FPS game. Having such a complicated controller for that genre of games might not be ideal. So if you're going to play turn-based games mostly, this is probably not the controller that you want necessarily. If you got this controller, maybe you're interested in any of the other genres that I mentioned, then this controller is still a good option to use, and here's why. So I actually prefer to use the directional pad with it, so I didn't swap any of that out, and I returned to the original configuration altogether. You don't have to use triggers very often in turn-based games, so you can just ignore all of that, but just the responsiveness of the clicky directional pads, and also of just the X, square, triangle, and circle buttons, it's just ideal. It's so good. Even though for a game like this, I would prefer to use a lighter, much smaller controller, something just a lot simpler. If this is the only controller that I have in hand, this is still a good one to use if I'm completely honest. I still enjoyed playing with this, even if it's not my preference for this genre of games. So Performance in Death's Gambit, which is a side-scrolling 2D game, controller also performed very well, and I never really realized how nice having such a complicated controller would be for that kind of game, considering that it is kind of an old school style game, I suppose. So using the joystick to move around just felt very smooth. Using the buttons to attack, because they're so clicky, they are mechanical buttons, it just felt so good. And even the weight of this controller, it made it feel like it was a more competitive game to me than it technically is. Even though it's not particularly the most simplistic game that you can find around, it still has some good mechanics and things that do give some depth to it. So playing with a controller like this was definitely still a ton of fun. And if you prefer to use a D-pad, instead you do have the option to do that, even though the game mostly controls through the joysticks. Luckily, the joysticks are very smooth and very good in my opinion. Lastly, in a 2D fighter, such as Dragon Ball FighterZ, this controller is actually just about perfect, in my opinion. The reason why I say that is because you can swap over to the other D-pad, which, while the button presses are definitely softer than they would be on this directional pad, it does make it a lot easier to do rolls and do combos with those. Even though I still like to use the joystick for this kind of thing, at least when I'm using this controller in particular. The convex stick, which does make rolling and doing combos also very easy. So whichever configuration you prefer, if you prefer to use the joystick or the D-pad, you do have the option for both, and they both perform wonderfully. And again, how sensitive the buttons are, how easy and nice they are to click, and how rapid you can get with these. It's just this controller seems to be built so well for this genre of games, and I really like playing fighting games using this controller. And in terms of battery life, this controller is actually still quite good, I'd say. Obviously with the RGB lights and depending on what patterns you got on and that sort of thing, and also the strength of your motors, this controller might just last you a couple of hours if you're using it completely for hours straight at a time. However, if you're just using this intermittently, or let's say if maybe you can make some adjustments such as the brightness, maybe lower that a little bit, reduce the strength of the motors and that sort of thing, this controller can easily last you all day, at least for my testing. Though, for the most part, I like to play wired, so that's not really a big concern for me. Either way, the battery life is still pretty decent, and I would trust it for long trips or that sort of thing. Now, I love this controller, and I'm sure that became very obvious as I've been praising this controller to high heaven for the entirety of this review. However, I do have some gripes with it, and they are quite a bit. Some things might actually be deal breakers for some people, and if I didn't already have this controller in hand, they probably would have been deal breakers for me too. So, let's get started. So for starters, you can program the extra buttons to the face buttons, which is nice. It offers some level of customization, but it is very disappointing that you can't add macros, include any kind of keyboard shortcuts to this. So on PC, this is still a bit of a limiting experience if you ask me. There are cheaper controllers that allow you to do macros and that sort of thing, and it is definitely very disappointing to see that this controller, even after the original Raiju, still didn't have those issues, and people did still complain about that. Still doesn't have that here. It's just very disappointing. It makes this just a little bit less usable for certain kinds of games, like maybe MMOs or that sort of thing. So until Razer makes those changes to this controller, I will continue to use a mouse and keyboard. Also, this controller, when it comes to remapping the buttons, adjusting the lightings or any sort of thing, just anything that depends on me having to connect this to the app, is a huge pain in the behind. And here's why. The app is just incredibly unreliable. If you try to connect this controller to the app, it might work the first time, but every other time after that, you will have to pretty much go through the exact same setup process every single time just to make the changes that you would want to this controller. That's why I've actually stuck to just a single configuration for this controller, just because I don't want to bother with that stupid app that barely works half of the time. When you're finally in, sure, it works great. You can make a ton of changes, but just getting there takes longer than it does to actually customize things. I don't know if this is just a general issue, but this is a problem I have consistently had with the Razer Raiju. And technically this is my second controller, since the previous one that I had a bit of a battery issue, but this one still is having that issue with connecting to the app, so that is still very disappointing. And a moment like this is where I really wish that this would work with Razer Synapse, even if it means that I have to connect it to a computer in order for it to work. The Synapse is much more reliable than the Razer Raiju app. It's just a fact. Stick drift is very real with this controller, and it is a problem I have experienced in the past. So what happens is that sometimes when you're playing a game with this controller and you move the joystick, you might let go of it for seconds, and then your character is still going to continue to move and go around and do whatever it wants, essentially, which is very annoying. And that just happens because of a miscommunication between your system and the controller itself. Who's sending what signal? It's usually the fault of the controller. Now, while that is a real issue and can definitely ruin your gameplay, especially if you're playing online, you do not want to see that sort of thing. And it is definitely a deal breaker for some people. I have to say that I only experienced the stick drift when I played in Bluetooth mode, and only if I was very far from the device that I was playing from, like let's say maybe about 8 feet away from the device that I was playing from, which is still relatively far. If I'm using this in Bluetooth mode and I'm pretty close to my device, there's pretty much zero stick drift coming from this controller, whether it's the PS4 or the PC. And in wired mode, regardless of how far away I am, this has never been a problem because it's never happened. So with that said, It's not a huge problem for me because I mostly play wired, but even when I do play in Bluetooth mode, I'm usually not far away from my device, so it's not something that really bothers me that much. But if you are expecting to be far away from your device, either settle for playing in wired mode or just get closer to your device, or this might just not be the device that you're looking for. And another issue is that this controller is severely expensive. When I bought this controller, it cost me around $279. This controller cost me more than the PlayStation 4 when I purchased it, which is absolutely ridiculous. If this didn't also work with my PC, I would have never purchased this as well. I saw the price and I still went ahead and purchased it, so obviously I'm guilty of that and I am still part of the problem. If this is not the budget, or if you're not comfortable spending this much money on a controller, then do not go for this controller because it will not be worth it. It is just a game controller and it won't give you much of a competitive edge if I'm honest. Though if you want a much better feeling controller than the one that you might already have, if you're just using a normal DualShock 4, then you can just go for the Razer Raiju Tournament Edition, which is much cheaper than this controller and offers a lot of the same features, even if the buttons are a little bit offset. Still, that controller is a much better value than this one is in essence. Now, I'm not a complete fool. I realize that this controller does have a lot of things that are still a deal breaker despite how expensive it is, and that price tag being a huge part of the problem, if you ask me. After spending all of that money on this controller, I do have to say that I'm honestly still happy with it. This is still the best game controller I have ever used. It is my favorite one, and I believe that this is still going to be the one that I'm going to hang on to. No controller quite feels like this one, quite plays like this one, and even quite looks like this one. This is just the nicest controller. Though if I had an Xbox, I would have gone for one that is pretty much identical to the Razer Raiju, but is leaps and bounds cheaper than this one, even though in terms of quality, they're just about the same. But because I have a PlayStation 4, I was cursed to have to go with a much more expensive one if I wanted the upgrade that I was looking for. I don't regret purchasing this controller, as I've been giving it a ton of use. I think it's awesome, and I was able to comfortably afford it on my end. If that's not something that you can do, if you can't possibly fathom getting this controller while not feeling at least a little bit guilty, if that is just something that you believe that you can't do, then do not go for this controller, because in that case, this is not a good value at all. Go for the Razer Raiju Tournament Edition, or even other controllers that do offer more customization than this guy does, as much as this already does. However, for myself, maybe it's not completely worth it, but it is worth it enough for me to keep, and yeah, this is still the best controller I've ever used. It's my favorite. I love it. I want to keep it. With that said, that's just my take on this controller. And if you are interested in buying the Razer Raiju Ultimate, the Razer Raiju Tournament Edition, or any of the Raiju controllers from their lineup, I'll be leaving affiliate links to Amazon in the description to those, as well as affiliate links to any other suggestions that might work just as substitute, maybe more budget-friendly solutions to this controller. Now again, as I mentioned, these are affiliate links, so if you do decide to use our links to make a purchase, we do get a small commission that does help us run things a little more smoothly around here. So if you did use our links, we would appreciate that quite a lot. Also, we just launched a Patreon recently, where for as little as $5 a month, you can join our private Discord, and if you do so, we would definitely love to chat with you down there. We will be making sure to leave links to that in the description as well, so do make sure to check that out if you're interested. This has been Francisco from Tech Summit. Thank you for watching, and I'll be seeing you all later. Enjoy.